Now, you remember back in 1968, there was that powerful moment in the Olympics when Tommy Smith and John Carlos won gold and bronze in the 200-meter race in Mexico City. And they put on black gloves and raised their hands in protest for what was happening in the country. In that year, of course, Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr. had been assassinated, and they wanted to speak out for all the people who were beaten down. They wanted to speak out for equality, and they also wanted to speak out for all those who lived in poverty. They actually did not have their shoes on. You can't see it in that picture, but that's why they took their shoes off in protest of that as well. And there were some badges there. But what you might not have noticed is the person no one ever noticed in that picture, Peter Norman. Peter Norman's an Australian, and he came in second that year in the Olympics. A huge upset. They didn't think he was going to finish in the top three at all, and he ran an amazing race. In fact, he was so fast that day that his record in the 200 meter still stands as the Australian record to this day. He ran it back in 1968. Isn't that amazing? So what did Norman do? I mean, he didn't really do anything. He didn't have the black glove on. He didn't seem to support them, right? Wrong. So this is the fascinating story of Peter Norman. It turns out he's the one that gave them the gloves in the first place. And they said, well, we only have one pair. He's like, why don't both of you wear them? Just wear one apiece. Okay, so they're like, well, do you want to participate in this? He's like, absolutely. What can I do? Well, there was this patch that they used to have back then called the Olympic Project for Human Rights. And what that stood for is being on the side for equality no matter where you are. And he wore that badge. He didn't have that badge, but an Olympic rower from the U.S. team, when he found out that a white Australian was going to participate in this protest, he couldn't believe it. And he's like, that's fantastic. Now, why couldn't he believe it? And he gave him, the American rower gave Norman the badge to wear that night, and he did wear it along with Carlos and Smith. Why is it so amazing? Well, you might not know this or remember it, but back then Australia had apartheid, like South Africa did. And in a lot of ways that apartheid was quite vicious. It had heavy restrictions on non-white immigration, discriminatory laws against Aboriginal people in Australia, and even forced adoptions of native children to white families. And basically, by wearing that badge and being on that podium, they thought that he was collaborating with Carlos and Smith. And Carlos and Smith describe it this way. When they talked to Norman about it, Carlos said, I expected to see fear in Norman's eyes, but instead we saw love. Now, in Australia, there were consequences. 4 years later, at the 1972 Summer Olympics that took place in Munich, Germany, Norman wasn't part of the Australian sprinters team, despite having run qualifying times for the 200 meters 13 times and the 100 meters 5 times. So, just to be clear on that, he made it onto the team, fair and square, 13 different times for the 200 and 5 times for the 100. They said, yeah, that's true, but you stood with those black guys, so you're not allowed on the team. Films for Action continues. Back in the change-resisting, whitewashed Australia, he was treated like an outsider, his family outcasted, and work impossible to find. For a time, he worked as a gym teacher, continuing to struggle against inequalities as a trade unionist, and occasionally working in a butcher shop. John Carlos continued to say, if we were getting beat up, and they were, there was a lot of consequences for Carlos and Smith when they came back. They were thrown out of our Olympic committee and our teams. They were stripped of their medals. But Carlos says, if we were getting beat up, Peter was facing an entire country and suffering alone. Now, even as we celebrate Carlos and Smith here in this country, for example, San Jose University has a statue up of that moment. And let's take a look at that statue for a second. And this is not unusual. I don't mean to pick on them. But Norman's completely left out of the statue. He's not even there. Nobody ever talks about him, right? Well, turns out that Norman could have saved himself, and here's a further explanation of that. Remember, his life is ruined. They won't let him go back into the Olympics. They won't let him do anything related to the Olympics. Has to work in a butcher shop. There's one way out. For years, Norman had only one chance to save himself. He was invited to condemn his co-athletes, John Carlos and Tommie Smith's gesture, in exchange for a pardon from the system that ostracized him, a pardon that would have allowed him to find a stable job through the Australian Olympic Committee and be part of the organization of the 2000 Sydney Olympic Games. Norman never gave in and never condemned the choice of the two Americans. That's the 2000 Sydney Olympic Games. Even though he was one of their literally greatest athletes in Australian history, they did not let him march, let alone giving him a job. They didn't let him march in the 2000 Sydney Olympics under the banner of Australia. That was well after apartheid's gone. All that old system is beaten down. They're past it, but they still held a grudge. How dare you not denounce those two black guys? In 2006, Norman died. Unfortunately, no better off financially in his life. And when he was being buried, his two old friends, John Carlos and Tommie Smith, went to his funeral and carried his casket. Finally, in the year 2012, the Australian Parliament passed a law saying apologies to Peter Norman for the wrong done by Australia in failing to send him to the 1972 Munich Olympics, despite repeatedly qualifying, and belatedly recognized the powerful role that Peter Norman played in furthering racial equality. Look, what everybody did there was brave, heroic. And we know about John Carlos and Tommie Smith, and they are rightfully celebrated now. But let's not forget Peter Norman, who was one of the quiet heroes. And that happens in all of these movements. They're the guys we celebrate and the guys we know for very, very, very good reasons. But they're the quiet heroes who sometimes suffer alone, and in some ways, just as heroic, at least, because they're not celebrated. He was never celebrated in his life, and he died being ostracized from his own country. And he took all that on for one simple reason, because he wanted to do the right thing. And when they asked him, hey, are you mad at Carlos and Smith for taking away your moment? You broke this record for your own country. You ran an amazing race, and all the news was about them. And he answered, I couldn't have been prouder to be part of that moment. Unfortunately, he took that to his grave. There are great heroes in the world, some we know about and some we don't. Thank you, Peter Norman.